I think we can start now. Hello, all. Good afternoon. A very warm welcome to one and all. Hope you are safe and sound. First of all, let me thank you for raising our morale high and encouraging us by showing your keen interest in our first webinar series, which is been held on Interface, a webinar series on literature and beyond. In this lecture series, we have planned 4 lectures on very interesting topics by eminent scholars. And one of them is, of course, my colleague, Mr. Vicky Gaikwad, who has got tremendous expertise on literary theory and criticism, translation studies, cinema and theater, comparative literature, comparative literature. Today, he is going to speak on mutualism between cinema and literature, a historical perspective. In fact, I must admit over here that he's the one who has put in a lot of efforts for organizing this webinar. So the entire credit goes to him. The second webinar will be on 18th May on Living in Translation, Introduction to Translation Studies by Dr. Kavita Patil. The third webinar will be on 20th May. The topic will be Being in Doubt, Language and Pandemic. It is again going to be very interesting and relevant topic. It will be delivered by Dr. Anil Sonavane. And on 22nd, that is 22nd May, we have our last webinar that will be on the art of pages, a discussion on history of the book, which will be delivered by Miss Vidisha Bagul. So this is a brief introduction and schedule. So dear friends, I hope you will enjoy and be benefited by this webinar, scholarly discourse, and continue supporting us for upcoming webinars too, of course, with the same zeal and enthusiasm. Once again, on behalf of the Department of English, I welcome you all. Over to you, Vicky.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Uh, uh, Welcome to everyone. I would just request all of you to uh, switch off the video, and so at least we won't have problem in the streaming of this. I mean, it's advised that well, if the videos and audios are shut down, then we can have bit clarity. So I would just request all of you to switch off your videos. Uh, as sir has already said, the topic of my lecture, or let's say it's just a session, we were anticipating it to be a very informal sitting, and so I'm trying to do that. Uh, let's just imagine we're sitting in a porch, not really on table or so, and uh, having this discussion. So I'll start with my presentation uh, on the topic that I'm proposing today, which is mutualism between cinema and literature. Uh, as we are again getting used to this new way of sharing things, like through internet and so on, I would also uh, request everyone to adjust and cooperate if anything technically goes wrong. Needless to say this, but I'm still just wanted to articulate this fact. Mm, I'll soon try. Now, when I say mutualism, I'm borrowing this concept from a scientific term, which is comes from biology, and mutualism in it's drawn from biology, which denotes where two organisms in different, or two organisms of different species, while they exist in a relationship in which each individual benefits from the activity of the other, and this relationship is acknowledged or maybe unacknowledged, but it exists. I must I must say at the outset that what I'm going to do here is not going to be an argument or so on. It's more about citing certain correspondences that took place during the early 20th century, which is also called as the modern age, between literature and cinema, and certain people that who existed at that time, certain writers and filmmakers and so on. Not really in abundance, but just two, three examples. So at the outset, I would just like to say that it's not going to be a conventional discussion on cinema literature in relation to their adaptation or their medium or form or so on. It's basically an exercise in reading historical discourse, and that's why I have called it a historical approach. And when I say history, I would just also put these pointers as a beginning of our discussion, uh, where seen something that doesn't really exist, uh, or it's not available to your senses, but it's still there. That ghostliness came with cinema has that characteristic. And the another aspect of the notion of ghost is uh, the disjunct in the linearity of time that we experience. You know that what is ghost but past peeking into the present, and then something that doesn't have an extension in future. So at the outset, these two, three notions of their medium, or the parallelism between cinema and literature, is this notion of ghost and ghostliness of both the mediums is important in the current scenario, when we are now sitting in the same kind of ghostly apparatus, where I'm not really being able to see you, but you're there. Similarly, I'm there, but not there, and so on and so forth. So being there and being not there. And that's why I feel that while talking about cinema and literature, the historical approach in the early 20th century, while talking about these two mediums, uh, kind of become kind of may provide a good input to provide a model to how to look at these two mediums in a historical discourse. So I've already explained what I mean by mutualism and what I mean by history. So when I just say literature and cinema, I particularly mean literature as in modern literature of 20th century, and cinema. Now, cinema word is also important because cinema, the word signifies a place where films are screened, and it also signifies the film as an art, or film as a medium of communication. So we are using it in both manner. The word modern uh, comes from a Latin word modernus, which means just now. Again, the disjunct in the temporality, disjunct in the flow of time. And why it is important? Because the early 20th century, or the modernism as a conceptual apparatus, carried a lot of thoughts of doing things, and uh, in 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 this context, a lot of things were happening at the same time, and because they were happening at the same time, that nowness was there. So you cannot just say that, okay, yesterday this happened, and now we can move ahead, because every day something was being invented. If I just say it roughly, for example, if you see, the year 1900 was so strange. If you talk about the inventions, Sigmund Freud would come up with interpretation of dreams. Arthur Evans would do his expedition and reach to Crete. Hugo de Rais would identify something that's called genes, and Max Planck will find out atom, that is later called as quantum, in a single year. And so every year of the early 20th century was known for certain invention, certain thought-provoking ideas being presented, and they were. It's not only in science, it's not only in sociology, but it was there in art form as well. So, all of them were, uh, in a way, helping each other, or overlapping, and that's why a very interesting way of describing the modern era is uh, the word used by this German novelist Hugo von Hofmannsthal, who says that the epoch, the epoch of 20th century was, um, can be characterized by something called the Gleitende, the sliding, where everything fell into parts, and the parts again fell into parts, and they were, uh, so everything was on the sliding. And that's why when I'm again saying mutualism, I mean that the early 20th century was characterized by the sliding of thoughts. So maybe the sliding of, if you can say, sliding of imagism into new criticism, or you can say sliding of, let's say, cinema into literature, a sliding of quantum mechanism to music. Very interesting fact that Max Planck and Schoenberg would collaborate on playing piano and so on. So I'm talking about that kind of sliding. And so early 20th century was characterized by this idea of sliding. You could not have a fixed concept, uh, uh, which will be a stuck, stable notion of looking at things. And in this background, there was this new art form that came in 1895. Of course, it was not that it came on that in that year only, but inventions were going on, discoveries were going on in cinema. But on 26th of December 1895, Lumiere brothers would also screen their first. They will have their first public screening, and cinema comes in this. On this backdrop, you have this visual medium coming on the scene, and because of that, cinema modified the notion of vision and seeing for people. It was considered, if you go by someone called Oswald Spengler, he says that the early 20th century is characterized by this dominance of seeing, where people are not, uh, we are losing the sober history of hearing and going towards this dominant of seeing the world as a picture. It has an interesting relationship with the notion of surveillance and so on. When you see someone, or the voyeuristic uh, equation between film and the audience. So on this thing, I've just been messaged by, yeah, sorry. So saying this, now I want to come to the major point. So what I'm going to do now is that I'm going to tell you, I'm just going to describe a story where four major figures of literature, uh, James Joyce, uh, Virginia Woolf, Federico Garcia Lorca, a Spanish poet, and Sergei Eisenstein, a Russian filmmaker, come together. Uh, or in this story, these are the characters. along with two another uh, s- uh, to another other important personalities from both literature and cinema, a comedian called Buster Keaton, and obviously Samuel Beckett, who is again an important figure in modern literature. It's interesting that if you see James Joyce and Virginia Woolf and Eisenstein and Lorca have a same birth year. Uh, the pair coincidentally has, James Joyce and Virginia Woolf were born in 1882, and same for Lorca and Sergei Eisenstein, both were born in 1898. And you will find a lot of such similarities of sharing of birth year. It's not really relevant here, but uh, uh, here I just wanted to draw that synchrony, sync, draw that parallel line between these figures as well. So, in the story that I'm going to tell you is that all these four figures, along with these two other characters, how they collaborated, uh, not really intentionally perhaps, but that happened. And all these characters were major in defining what you now know as modern cinema, modern literature, or modern drama, modern theater, and so on and so forth. So I'll just start with a story of uh, Garcia Lorca, Federico Garcia Lorca. Now, in 1920s, Lorca found himself in New York, and he writes a collection there. He left Andalusia, and he stayed in New York for a while, and he wrote a poetry collection there, a poetry collection called Poet in New York. And in this poetry collection, he depicted the American materialism, and I have given those quotes on the slide so you can read on your own, where he's describing the city, how it was, the line that he says, "Those who suffer, suffer without rest." So it was kind of shocking for him when he saw this materialistic approach and the urban structure of this urban city, where disparity was very high. And while he was amused uh, through the discourse, he also got fascinated with this comedian Buster Keaton. Now, about Buster Keaton, those who don't know Buster Keaton, his the early he worked along with Chaplin, but was overshadowed by Chaplin. And Buster Keaton was known for a comic effect, the physical comedy, or later on we also call it slapstick comedy. But one thing that separated him from Charlie Chaplin was that he would have facial expressions, his static facial expression. And I'll just show you this clip, if it's visible. Can you see the clip? Uh, it's a silent film called General, the General.
Yeah, we can. Yeah,
Yeah, and if you see, uh, Buster Keaton was known for such. So he was known for such physical comedies and doing it with a very static face, without giving any expression. Now, Lorca, with his fascination, decides to write a play. He writes a play, and I'm again using present tense because, as I just said, that the disjunction of time, the disjunction of the sequential time, is important in the to understand the idea of modern. So Lorca writes a play on depicting this walk by Buster Keaton, and he calls it Buster Keaton Takes a Walk. And he wrote it in 1925, and then later on it was published in April 1928 in his own magazine called Gallo. And he will also do a loud reading of this play in cinema club of Spain, a Spanish cinema club. And if you see the notes of this play. Obviously, the play was characterized by the characteristic of the play was that it was a puppet play, and it did not have any coherence. So the dialogues were not really coherent. People, if you just read here, it says, "I have nothing to say," and then "You are crazy." Okay, there is no sequence. What is important is the description, the notes that you have for the puppet play. I have highlighted the description of his eyes, the way Buster Keaton's eyes are described, his sad, infinite eyes. His eyes are like bottom of a glass, very ugly, very beautiful, and auspicious eyes. There's also one description where it says an American woman with celluloid eyes. This idea of celluloid eyes, or again the note in the second last line where it says Buster Keaton smiles and looks at the woman's shoes in close up. Uh, the the style of language that is used is quite influenced by cinema, a film. Looking at something in close up. If you see, there is, and puppet play has a large relationship with cinematic art form that came early 20th century. But here, we see in Lorca's language is quite influenced by the filmic uh, vocabulary. However, for our discussion, I would just want you all to remember this description of Buster Keaton's eyes. The eyes that are like the bottom of glass. And he is kind of trying to depict the expressionless notion that you see in Buster Keaton's character that he plays. So Lorca's first public engagement with cinema comes with this play, and there is an influence on his writing as well. Now, the next character in our story is uh, James Joyce. Uh, was again born, as we have already seen, 1882, died in 1941. Now, James Joyce, as you all know, hopefully everyone who has read literature or people who have heard about literature know that Joyce wrote his magnum opus was Ulysses, which was published in 1922. And it's considered as one of the most important works of modernist literature. However, before Joyce even started writing this book around 1907-08, he was wondering about how a human mind works, how human mind thinks. uh, when we think, we do not think in sequence. We do have this act of jumping from one point to another, from going from one point to another without following the sequential line. And not only Joyce, but obviously at that time, William James has already thought about it, and he had wrote a book in which he called it a stream of thought. And later on, literature, the same idea.
Vijay,
Hello? Yeah, sir.
sorry, I'm interrupting. There is a
Huh.
message saying
Huh.
that some people are willing to join. Did you just enter them?
I've
Just check out the
tried.
message.
Yes, yes, yes. I'm trying. Mm, uh, Unfortunately, I can't see the notifications also.
Okay, please continue. The message is displayed there
Yeah, yeah, I
from
just saw the
Kavita
message.
Patil. Yeah, Kavita Patil is saying.
I'll just see it. There are some notifications. Generally, there is a notification when someone tries to join. So, wondering why. However, should I continue? Then?
Anyways, Please
Maybe
continue.
there might be some technical flux. I don't know because
Yeah,
I did not.
we all are new to this platform. It's okay.
Yeah, so I'm
Go
just,
ahead. Yeah.
yeah, sorry for the inconvenience for those who are not able to, but I can't see a notification there. So Joyce, before he wrote Ulysses, was fascinated with this idea, and he was trying to figure out how to capture this continuous jumping of thoughts, the stream of thought in writing. And so when he was not that famous, he had gone to a tour in Italy around 1908 and 1909. And in Italy, he sees this first film screening, and he gets very fascinated or enamored by the uh, film screening there. And he comes back in 1909, and James Joyce would open a theater in Dublin in 1909. It's called the Volta, and it will be a Dublin's first permanent cinema. And he will also hold a screening on the Christmas Eve in that film hall. Why I'm calling it a first proper cinema hall, because this was first time that the proper cinematically, it was people watching cinema in a cinematically cinematic situation. What do we mean by that is that it had the same kind of setting that we have now when when you have darkness and so on. Before this time, there was no darkness allowed in cinema hall as well. So people won't switch off the lights before this film starts. But with Joyce, that trend will start in Dublin and in Britain, and then gradually it will come to US and so on. So it was kind of a first kind of its own screening. And Joyce was less known during that time. And while he when the screening ended on that Christmas Eve, while coming out of the cinema hall or cinema, he saw that he observed that the audience who watched the film under the was under the spell of cinema, the darkness, the illuminated white patch, the moving images, and they were struggling to speak up, or they couldn't make out the story clearly. And so when they came out, their communication lacked the kind of coherence that we have, and it hardly made sense. And Joyce noted that they speak in broken sentences. So here Joyce gets his first hint from cinema, and the audience exposed to cinema, of how the mind works under the spell of images, memories, associations that are not turned into literature. And such are the following thoughts that are not translated into conversation of language, and how they slide from one end to another, unconcerned of meaning, but still creating one. So Joyce, through cinema, could find a different entry point to human mind and to literature, to have used this method in writing his letter Vouvre. And in 1916, maybe, if I'm not wrong, he would write the portrait of the artist as a young man. And in this case, so it is cinema adding into literature, changing literature, and giving it a different kind of tone that we see later on developing into Joyce's uh, work. Uh, the next character in the story is uh, Sergei Eisenstein. So in Joyce, we have cinema adding to literature. Next character in our story is Sergei Eisenstein, who was a Russian or Soviet film director. And he entered this filmmaking around 1924, 1925. And his entry point in the cinema was the editing technique. And he was looking for a language of cinema that would avoid the linear storytelling method. We are talking about a time when cinema or film as was not respected as an art form. We are talking about, it was just considered as mostly industrial. It is in 1919 that first time you will see a popular narrative cinema will come in. And with Eisenstein, its technical richness will also increase. And so he he found out a new way of telling stories through images, association of distinct images, to what he calls montage, where you have two different images put together, juxtaposing each other, and they create certain meaning there. I'll just again show you an example. Uh, it's it's a it's an example from one of his teachers, which is, it's called Kuleshov effect. Uh, so in this clip, you see what they did. They just put two images together, replacing one single image with another. And they showed this to people. In the first clip, you see a plate, then the man's face, then a dead body and the man's face, then a woman, and then again the man's face. And when they asked people uh, whether, and the expressions are same, but when people were asked what they fathom of this image, they were saying that in first image he looked hungry, in the second image he looked sad. Here is Hitchcock describing the same technique. See this old man cut to a woman with kid, and cut back to a man and his reaction, and he smiles. And it says a lot about this character. Now, same, if you see, same man cut back to a girl in the bikini, smiles. And this is what montage was all about. So the combination of different images would give a different meaning each time. So this character that you see in both the images can mean different, just because they are put together. And that's what Eisenstein called montage. It's very interesting at the same time, or quite like right, maybe before this invention in cinema technique, Ezra Pound and all the writers in Imagist movement were also practicing this kind of association or juxtaposition of two images in written word. And they were inspired from the haiku. And I have given this one example from Ezra Pound's poem, The Apparition of These Faces in the Crowd, where two images are put together, juxtaposing each other, and they have a freedom to form different meaning. This is what Eisenstein did. Now, the interesting point for our story comes that Eisenstein knew about James Joyce's work, and he also had Ulysses, he had read Ulysses in Russian translation, and he received his copy of Ulysses uh, around 1925 when it was just 3-year-old. And so in one of his diaries entry on March 8, 1928, you see this diary of Eisenstein's diary entry in Eisenstein's book, where he says, "On Saturday, I received my copy of Ulysses, the Bible for new cinema." And also in one of his works where he wrote, or he was working on Das Kapital, he writes, "This film would be dedicated on the Second International, but the formal side to James Joyce." Again, it's an entry from 15th February 1928. Uh, and James, so in August, sorry, so here you see that Eisenstein was pretty much influenced or was considering. So in the earlier example, you say that Joyce draws on cinema, and then Ulysses becomes here the Bible of the new cinema for Eisenstein. And from 1920 onwards, you will see Eisenstein quite often referring Ulysses as a particular suitable base for training visual consciousness. So much so that in August 1929, when he was on the tour, so his Eisenstein and his colleagues were on 1 year's leave for to study sound films in Western Europe. And he went out of money. And in Europe, then because he went out of money, he was invited. He started giving lectures in Berlin, London, Brussels, and Paris. And Eisenstein spent of most of his November in London at that time. And here Eisenstein meets G.B. Shaw, one of the prominent, again, playwright in English literature. And Eisenstein is invited by the London Film Society to give lectures. And it's also interesting that the founding members of this London Film Society, which is again one of the first film societies of the world during that time, were George G.B. Shaw, John Case, Halden, Virginia Woolf, Clive Bell, Roger Fry, and so on. And most of them were later to be known literary personality who actively took notice of cinema and discussed its potential and drawbacks and so on and so forth. For example, Hilda Dolittle, who is known as HD, started a magazine, a journal, a film journal, Close Up, during 1927 to 1933. And a lot of people contributed to it. It's very interesting also that Ezra Pound would contribute to these, and he would be a patron to James Joyce, and he'll also write about films. He will also help many people. And here I just want to briefly go to our third character in the story, uh, cut to Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf in 1926 wrote an essay called The Cinema. And why I have mentioned, or why she becomes an important character in this story, is that she would constantly, and all these people, the people that I just mentioned who belong to London Film Society, would constantly write about cinema. And Virginia Woolf, in this essay, The Cinema, uh, first time for in that for that instance, first time would treat cinema as an art form. She will talk about how it's realistic, how it also has, and she will criticize the silent cinema, but at the same time, so this criticism would be able to bring cinema on the paradigm of art forms, because one of the writers was writing about it. And I've just highlighted the last paragraph here. I've quoted it from the same essay. Uh, I'll just. And she says that if a shadow at a certain moment can suggest so much more than the actual gestures and words of men and women in a state of fear, it seems plain that cinema has within its grasp innumerable symbols for emotion that have so far failed to find expressions. So she's kind of appreciating the ability of cinema to create something visible that's not able to come through the use of words. And I have mentioned a quote by earlier by Joseph Conrad, where he says that I want to show something to you through words. So that's why Virginia Woolf's role in the history of cinema or literature becomes important. And we all know that she was also one of the practitioners of what you later on know as stream of consciousness, along with James Joyce. So getting back to the story, uh, so Eisenstein, while he gives the lectures in the London Film Society, he decides to meet James Joyce. He thinks that James Joyce in Ireland during that time, but unfortunately, James Joyce had moved to Paris by that time, and Eisenstein decides to meet him. And so while going back, he takes a detour and he goes to Paris to meet James Joyce. And James Joyce, by this time, had gone blind completely. And he might be writing his last novel during that time. So on 30th November 1929, Eisenstein meets Joyce. Now, there are no mentions of this meeting in Joyce's writing. But Eisenstein wrote about this meeting in October 1932 in a theoretical essay called A Course in Treatment. And he says, when Joyce I met in Paris, he was intensely interested in my plans for the inner film monologue and expressive. And he also mentions that Joyce wished to see his films and so on. The another entry in one of his memoirs, which was published in 1946, he says that I think that this outer blindness is conditioned, and his inner perspicacity, as when describing inner life in Ulysses, he seems interested in the experiments with film language that I'm carrying out, just as I'm interested in his literary experiment of a similar nature. And here you again see Eisenstein writing about this meeting. He and you will see that in all almost at many points in his memoirs, he keeps referring to Ulysses. Just for example, again, when he says no Western phenomena is more interest to the art of film than Ulysses. So there was a huge influence of Joyce's writing on his filmmaking. He also defended Joyce against the conservationist USSR critics like Carl Redeck, who called Joyce's writing nothing but a heap of cow dung and so on. So Eisenstein responds to that as well. Now, interestingly, you don't see Joyce really mentioning this meeting or talking about it, but there are certain entries uh, in Werner's book, where Joyce is said to tell his friend uh, that if he at all decides to make film of Ulysses, he'll just think about two filmmakers, Eisenstein and Ruttman. So here, in this context, you see that literature becomes a medium or an incentive to incite more experimentation into filmmaking. And this collaboration again is sliding, as we have mentioned earlier. It's like that. So this amid this story of Joyce and Eisenstein and their collaboration and so on and so forth, one character passes by uh, in this story, and that character is of this young Irish man. Now, when Joyce had gone completely blind, he had to depend on other people to write down his last work, the Finnegan's Wake. And his amnesius for this job, the person who took notes and wrote what Joyce dictated, was a young Irish poet. His name was Samuel Beckett, who helped Joyce at that time. Now, both Joyce and Beckett were Irish, but they met in Paris. And in 1929, Beckett publishes his work, uh, a critical essay called Dante, Bruno, Vico, and Joyce, where he defends Joyce's works. And there are various encounters and various stories where you will see that Beckett would write about uh, uh, Joyce. Now, Beckett, knowing about Joyce's meeting with Eisenstein in 1929, it seems unlikely that he may not know this. So, because he was very much there during the when Joyce was writing the novel. Now, even if Beckett had not known Eisenstein's support to Joyce's work, but he and Eisenstein did cross lines in writings when both of their articles were published in the journals like Close Up, Transition, Irish Statesman, or Ireland Today, and something like that. Now, while we are talking about, so Beckett was an amnesius to Joyce, and his connection with Eisenstein is not really that visible. But as I said, that they both crossed their roots in writing. But in 1936, on 2nd March 1936, a letter goes to Eisenstein, and he does not receive it, and it is filed, but he doesn't read it because Joyce was shooting his film during that time and he was in Mexico. And this letter says, I have no experience of studio work, and it is naturally in the scenario and editing and of the subject that I am most interested. It is because I realize that the script is the means of function of realization of the cinema that I am anxious to make. Contact with your mastery of these and beg you to consider me a serious cineast. Worthy of admission to your school, I could stay a year at least. So the letter was sent on 2nd March 1936, signed Samuel Beckett. So Beckett wanted to take admission in Eisenstein's film school. He wanted to learn uh, filmmaking, at least editing, but he couldn't get the admission, obviously, because the letter didn't reach. So with Beckett, you see that the story forms a circle here, because and in Beckett, uh, what you generally call the modern literature reaches to a next level. He was considered as an absurd theater artist or absurd dramatist, the tag that he denies. But the setting, the technique, the use of recorded music in his plays do allude to cinematic techniques in certain ways. You know, the incoherent conversation mostly function with distinct images coming with third one and links them together in his most of his play. Yeah. Uh, you will also see that Beckett's tramp-like characters in Waiting for Godot or another play, or his many of his plays, they do have this influence, or you can relate them with the early cinema where tramp characters, like played by Buster Keaton or Chaplin, do. Uh, there is certain similarity that you can locate between these characters, and also the physical comic element which converts into the absurd in his play. Now, obviously, he wanted to make film and he couldn't. He wanted to learn filmmaking, but he couldn't. So in 1964, Beckett decides to make a film, and he writes a script, and with collaboration with director Alan Schneider, he makes a 22 minutes long film called Film. Yeah, so being Beckett, he names this film a film, and film. Now this 22-minute film has characters called E and O. E is the camera, and O is the uh, main protagonist of it, and this O character is played none other than Buster Keaton in this film. And we'll just watch the opening of this film and the end of this film. This is Buster Keaton with an eye patch. And that's where that's the end. The film is available on YouTube. Those who are interested, do watch it. It's very interesting because in this film, Beckett is talking about the perceivedness of someone. He starts it with the Barclay's famous doctrine: to exist is to be perceived. And this character that you see, played by Buster Keaton, runs away from the camera. It doesn't want to be seen. And at the end, it finds itself seen by the camera, and that's how it exists. And then he closes the eyes. there are various parallels of this script, and you will see that it is haunted by Joyce and Eisenstein and their whole collaboration. If you really decide to trace the minute details, like the eye patch that you find in Buster Keaton wears, Joyce, when he was in his during his last day, used to wear an eye patch because he was going blind, and Beckett was his nemesis during that time. So that one connection can be formed. There are various anecdotes about the script writing and so on. But as I told you earlier, the uh, uh, the opening of this film and the end of this film, in the opening you see that the eye opens slowly, closes, opens again, and blinks, and then fades into the different rippled image. Yeah. And when the film ends, again the screen goes black, and we see an opening image of the eye, which is frozen, and then the credits roll back. This eye of Buster Keaton that engenders the trauma of the perceiver and the perceived. We see a sharpness, a sad terseness, and it also looks ugly because of the extreme close-up. The eye of Buster Keaton, uh, the portrayal of this eye kind of takes us back to the description of Keaton's eyes in Lorca's play, where he describes it as, sad, infinite eyes, like those of newborn beast of burden, eyes that are like the bottom of glass. But since it's a close-up, you do see a glass-like figure there. Very ugly, but very beautiful at the same time, and human eyes in the exact balance of melancholy. And but I must say that when I say so, I am not saying that Beckett is borrowing it from Lorca or so. This is an association that we are trying to form. So with this last character of our story, I can just say that the modern literature and cinema, as they belong to a product of the 20th century, uh, subsequently, by the way, I must mention that subsequently Beckett would transform his plays into films, and there was a project called Beckett on Film, conceived by Michael Clogan, who who performed and shot almost all of Beckett's short plays on for the film. And it's interesting that one of the plays that was shot, the lead character, Catastrophe, the lead character is played by Harold Pinter, who is again another playwright. That play is also available on YouTube. Do watch it. So the whole point of what I just did, I'm kind of going to end it here now. So that with Beckett, the literature goes, and the cinema also, the film is very good example of what you know as modern film, which came after 1950s, that experimental tone that you see in filmmaking. And so it's very good example, this correspondence that you see is very good example of the rhizomic like relationship that should be studied in a larger context as a literature student or someone who is interested in literature or cinema and so on. Obviously we do follow the medium conventions and so on, but in the historical context. And when I say rhizome is, I'm borrowing this concept from the developed as the concept developed by Giles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, which means a theory and research that allows for multiple non-hierarchical entry and exit points in representing the data and interpretation. So here in this story, you do see this mutualism between cinema and literature through these implicit, unacknowledged or acknowledged or coincidental correspondences between the major figures of the both the mediums, both cinema and literature. So I guess I am kind of done here. These are a few references if you uh, want to read more. And yeah, so I'm kind of done here. Kind of, I can say that I'm done. That's what I was.
Okay.
So yeah,
I
thank
think we
you.
can take questions with you.
Yeah, so if you have any suggestions, questions, please shoot. Saroja ma'am saying lockdown.
Many people are out there who they could not join our session today. Some
Ah,
technical.
Okay, Vicky, am I audible to you?
yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, so 1895, when you said this film for the first time was screened by Lumiere Brothers,
Hmm.
had it already been transformed into an art form, or were they still struggling with this technology and trying to find out what can be done with it? Because
Uh,
by that
yeah,
time,
yeah.
literature had already gained the status of an art because people could do lot many things with the words and language as such.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no. So actually, no. It was not considered as an art form, or it did not have the keenness of or the technical inventions. Also, Tom Gunning has written a very interesting essay where he calls it an exhibitionist cinema,
Mm,
which was so it was very static also. So if you see Lumiere Brothers, the film that they screened here was workers leaving the factory. So there was no camera movement, there was no editing as such. They'll just camera is placed somewhere and it was just capturing the people moving. The only peculiarity that it had was that people were moving in a way. So that's all. So it did not have that standard treatment as an art form, which literature had already gotten, and it did not have a lot of let's say room also, because considered as an industrial product, and Thomas Edison and all those people were treating it as such. So it's quite during around 1905, 1906, gradually. Uh, the first example would be 1912. Alice Guy makes a film called Life of Jesus Christ, uh, which had a proper narrative line. And George Méliès also, for instance, started treating the narrative. So yeah, for the first screening, it wasn't there. It was just a moving image. Yeah. Thank you for your question.
okay, thank you.
Yeah.
There might be some techniques adapted into novels from cinema, right? I'm asking you a very basic question. Can you
Uh-huh.
please name and elaborate some techniques? I mean, which techniques in that period, the period which you have tried to cover in your presentation, which
Hmm.
techniques from cinema were adapted while writing literature? Some of them.
One, there was no direct borrowing as such, that deliberate, but it did happen with the Dadaism coming in. The Dadaist movement that came around 1924, 1919, and the surrealist cinema. So basically, a French avant-garde movement that came in literature. They had borrowed a lot of. So there is interesting connection between Lorca, Louis Buñuel,
Mhm.
and Salvador Dali,
Okay.
because they both were, all three of them were in the same institute when they were studying. And from there, so mostly in French literature, you do find these connections where they did borrow certain techniques from. One of the major technique that was there was this use of mechanics in it, the idea of machine in a
Mm,
way, a very technical. There was this movement, a theater movement also, which came during this time, the cruelty theater,
mm.
and also Brecht's idea of distancing effect, for instance. So all these were, in a way, the influences of cinematic techniques of projecting reality. And if you see in Virginia Woolf also, where she says that showing something that's not able to that we are not able to say through words. So in that way, so the narrative technique, the visual technique, all these were borrowed mostly in theater and novel.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else? I think
Any other question? I just want to say one thing, that the students who are interested in pursuing literature further, there is a huge room in this uh, uh, towards this kind of approach of approaching literature and cinema. So that-
mutualism between cinema and
I
literature.
think there's a
Yeah,
question in the comments.
yeah, ma'am.
There's someone's asked a question in the comments.
Comment. Okay. Okay. What about montage in cinema and stream of consciousness technique in literature? Can we call it neutral vision? Hello. Yeah, Elvin. Of course, we can call it. In fact, I did try to connect them together here. Uh, uh, Not uh, in let's say we can't say that it's a watertight compartmentalized, or you do have exact same elements there, but yeah, we can say that it did help for both of them to grow. The idea of stream of consciousness, where one thought where the because there is a flow of thoughts, there is a way of juxtaposition as well. And in fact, that's why I had quoted a poem by Ezra Pound, The Apparition of These Faces in the Crowd, which also has these juxtaposition of two images. And in stream of consciousness, we do find that. So there is an interesting connection, or in your words, mutualism between the montage technique and the stream of consciousness technique in literature. So I think we can say that. And in fact, there are various correspondences between Ezra Pound, James Joyce, and Hilda Dolittle as well. And I must mention this, that Tagore also had certain collaborations with Ezra Pound during the same time. So you might want to explore that further.
Any other question there?
Okay.
I think questions have got over. So, thank you so much, Vicky, for such a wonderful and interesting lecture, which was filled with so many details. You tried to
Okay.
cover, you tried to cover various aspects, techniques of cinematography, and tried to relate them with literature. And while doing this, you tried to represent before us the entire landscape from the very beginning of 20th century, that is modernism. So it was very fascinating to listen to you. It was
Yeah.
very wonderful, and I hope all our participants must have benefited out of
Okay.
it.
There is
Thank
one
you.
question.
Okay, you can.
Sorry to interrupt. I guess there
No
is
problem.
one. Saroja ma'am has asked, how do you extend this rhizomic connection to historical home
Yeah, please go.
beyond the art forms? Ah, that's an interesting question. Thank you, ma'am. Uh, Actually, that's what I've been struggling with. Is like, uh, can we do that? And when we read, I mean, this paper I started writing around 2016, when I myself was asked in a PhD interview that why you are a student of literature, why are you doing research in films and so on. So I've been struggling with this. That is it possible? However, in in that point of time, early 20th century, we do have these rhizomic connections. Like for instance, Oswald Spengler, uh, who did write about a book called Decline of Man, where he talks about the oral and the dominance of vision and loss of hearing. Now, Oswald Spengler would be also a person who would introduce a young man to the German Workers' Party, the young man named Adolf Hitler in 1919. So uh, there are certain, or let's say, uh, the social Darwinism coming in during early 20th century, and at the same time there are inventions on race and so on. At the same time there are inventions on people's or the blood transfusion comes in. At the same time, 1905, Einstein would come up with his theory of quantum. So these connections out of the art form also, there are these sociological, cultural, historical, rhizomic collaboration that happened that in a way lead towards Nietzsche would write the laws of God and his theories would become popular. So, and at the same time, again in Germany, the Aryan supremacy would be promoted. So, I guess we can do that. There is an interesting book, I guess. I don't know whether you might have read it or, but it's called A Terrible Beauty by Patrick Watson, uh, which kind of gives us this whole overview of these connections. So
Terrible beauty.
if you say, sorry, hello,
I suppose it's a reference to it, the terrible beauty.
yeah, A Terrible Beauty by Patrick Watson. Hello.
Yeah, I'm there.
I hope I could answer. I just
No,
kind of get
you did. Yeah, you gave me a very good example. In fact, it's a question to think over rather than a question that can have a direct answer.
yeah, I know, right? That's why I just tried to.
It's important because Buddhism in particular has always faced the charge of being too closeted, being too unconnected with political reality, and yet it's a time when political reality was just too overwhelming.
Right,
Uh,
right, right.
when we turn back, we also need your rhizomic connections. I really like that note on which you ended because these are one way of restoring connections that you don't let be taken over by single narratives otherwise. And if you make these
Right.
connections, keep making these connections.
Yeah. Thank you, man. And that's seriously really important now. Thanks for your comment and good use of the play on lockdown. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Got it. So yeah, thank you so much for being there, for attending our first exclusive webinar session. Once again, I thank you all, and I expect same kind of enthusiasm for the next webinar. I mean, thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.